For 10 years, Silas lived alone in the wilderness, a man of pure muscle and iron will who feared nothing. But his isolated world shattered when he rescued a nameless, penniless woman from a deadly blizzard. She had nothing to her name except a mysterious locked box, and when they finally turned the key, the beast of the mountains realized his entire life had been a lie. The year was 1874, and the Colorado wilderness was a frozen hell. The Rocky Mountains were beautiful, but they were deeply deadly. A brutal winter storm was sweeping across the high peaks. The wind howled like a starving wolf, carrying a bitter, blinding frost. The temperature had dropped so low that a man's breath froze instantly in the air. In this unforgiving, icy wasteland, ordinary men quickly perished. But Silas Thorne was no ordinary man. The few travelers in the lower valley towns called him the Bear. Silas was a legendary mountain man, built like the ancient trees surrounding him. He stood well over 6 feet tall, possessing a massive, muscular frame. His broad shoulders were hardened by years of splitting logs and lifting boulders. His thick, dark hair hung long and wild, blowing violently past his shoulders. A dense, rugged beard covered his face, currently crusted white with heavy snow. Silas had spent nearly a decade living in complete isolation. He preferred the quiet company of the mountains over the greed of civilization. He survived by his own rules, his own strength, and his own sharp wits. On this treacherous afternoon, the blizzard was rolling in faster than expected. Silas wore a heavy, thick coat fashioned from the pelt of a timber wolf. In his massive, calloused hand, he gripped a heavy iron-headed chopping axe. He fought his way through the deep snowdrifts, each step requiring immense power. His heavy leather boots sank deep into the white powder with every stride. The freezing wind slammed against his muscular chest, but he did not falter. His immediate goal was to reach his isolated log cabin before the whiteout became total. He needed to stoke the stone fireplace and wait out the deadly night. But the mountain was about to alter his destiny forever. As Silas bypassed a dense thicket of frozen pine trees, his sharp eyes spotted something. A strange dark shape was partially buried under a fresh mound of snow. Silas stopped in his tracks, squinting through the blinding, swirling flakes. At first he thought it might be a fallen deer or a sleeping predator. But as he moved closer, a chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the weather. It was a human being, completely helpless against the storm. Silas dropped his heavy axe into the snow and rushed forward. He dropped to his knees and began clearing away the heavy layers of ice with his bare hands. To his absolute shock, he uncovered a young woman. Her clothes were tattered, thin, and completely inadequate for the brutal climate. She wore no heavy furs, no thick gloves, and her leather shoes were completely ruined. She looked entirely penniless, like a beggar who had wandered into the mouth of winter. Her face was dangerously pale, her skin almost translucent, and her lips were a deep blue. She was shivering uncontrollably, her body on the very brink of hypothermia and death. Yet despite her frail, near-lifeless state, something else caught Silas's attention. She was gripping an old, heavy wooden box tightly against her chest. Her thin arms were wrapped around it with a fierce, desperate strength. It was as if that box was her very last anchor to the mortal world. Silas gently tried to pry her fingers away to check her pulse, but her grip was frozen rigidly around the mysterious object. She would not let go, even in her unconscious state. Silas growled in frustration, his deep, gravelly voice cutting through the roaring wind. "Hey, open your eyes, you are going to freeze to death out here." There was no response. Her head simply rolled back, her long hair matted with ice. Knowing she had mere minutes to live, Silas made a swift decision. He slid his powerful, muscular arms beneath her fragile body. Using his immense strength, he hoisted both the woman and her box into the air. His long, dark hair whipped wildly across his face as he turned back into the storm. He began to sprint through the blinding whiteout, carrying her toward his sanctuary. Silas kicked open the heavy oak door of his cabin, stepping inside out of the gale. He slammed the door shut behind him, barring it with a thick wooden beam. The sudden silence inside the cabin was a sharp contrast to the madness outside. The air inside was cool, but the embers of his stone fireplace were still glowing red. Silas gently laid the unconscious woman onto a thick pile of soft deer furs near the hearth. He immediately knelt down and began throwing dry pine logs onto the fire. Within minutes, bright orange flames roared to life, casting a warm golden glow across the room. Silas carefully unwrapped her frozen outer garments, taking care not to disturb the box. Her fingers were still locked around the iron-bound wooden container like a vice. He wrapped her shivering torso in several layers of thick, warm woolen blankets. Silas then fetched a small tin pot, heating up water over the fresh flames. He returned to her side, gently lifting her head with one massive hand. With the other, he slowly dribbled a few drops of warm water between her parched blue lips. He watched her face intently, waiting for any sign of returning life. Outside, the blizzard grew into a monstrous tempest, shaking the very logs of the cabin. But inside, the intense heat of the fireplace was slowly doing its work. Color began to return to her pale cheeks, and her shivering began to subside. Silas sat back on a rough, hand-carved wooden stool, watching her silently. He picked up a piece of cedar wood and his hunting knife, beginning to whittle to pass the time. His long hair fell forward, shadowing his intense, watchful eyes. After 3 long, silent hours, the woman finally stirred. Her eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes that were wide with sudden panic. The very first words out of her mouth were a terrified, breathless whisper. My box. Where is it? Where is my box?" She tried to sit up, her weak muscles failing her, her hands frantically searching the blankets. Silas did not move from his stool, his deep, rumbling voice filling the cabin. "Rest easy, woman, you are alive, and that alone is a miracle on this mountain." He pointed his knife toward the hearth. "Your box is right there, exactly where you kept it." Clara looked toward the fire and saw the heavy wooden container resting safely on the furs. She let out a massive, trembling sigh of relief and immediately dragged it closer to her body. Silas stopped whittling and stared at her with his piercing, dark eyes. "I have lived in these mountains a very long time," Silas said, his tone heavy and curious. "I have seen greedy men freeze to death out here chasing rumors of gold and silver mines. But you have no food, no money, no proper coat, and no survival gear. You are completely penniless, yet you march straight into a deadly, freezing whiteout. What could possibly be inside that old piece of wood that makes it worth your life?" Clara looked up, her gaze meeting the fierce, intimidating eyes of the giant mountain man. She saw his massive shoulders, his wild, long hair, and the raw power he possessed. But she also saw the warmth in his cabin and realized he had saved her from a terrible death. "My name is Clara," she said, her voice still cracking from the residual cold. "And this is not just an ordinary box. It is either my death warrant or my only chance at a new life." Silas leaned forward, his muscular arms resting on his knees. He examined the box closely for the first time. It was made of a rare, dark hardwood, reinforced with thick, rusted iron bands. But the most striking feature was the lock. It was a massive, intricate antique mechanism made of blackened steel. It had no visible keyhole, only a series of strange engraved symbols around a central dial. Silas stood up, his towering, muscular figure casting a long, imposing shadow across the room. He walked over to the corner and picked up his heavy, razor-sharp iron chopping axe. "I am a man of the wilderness, Clara," Silas said, swinging the heavy axe effortlessly. "I have shattered solid granite and split ancient oak trees with this very blade. If you want to know what is inside, I can shatter that old steel lock with one single swing." He stepped closer, raising the axe slightly to demonstrate his immense strength. Clara's eyes widened in sheer horror, and she threw her fragile body over the box to shield it. "No, stop! Do not touch it with that axe!" she screamed, her voice echoing off the log walls. Silas froze, his axe poised in midair, his brow furrowed in confusion. "If you force that lock open by violence, we will both lose everything," Clara pleaded, breathing heavily. "The man who built this box was a master craftsman, a genius who trusted no one. Inside the wooden walls is a hidden spring-loaded mechanism filled with highly volatile acid. If the lock is shattered, if it is forced, or if the wrong tool is used, the glass vials inside will break. The acid will instantly flood the interior, destroying the contents and turning them to ash within seconds. It can only be opened safely with its true, unique key or by someone who knows the exact sequence." Silas stared at her for a long moment, slowly lowering his heavy iron axe. He realized she was telling the absolute truth. The terror in her eyes was entirely genuine. He set the axe aside and sat back down, his mind racing with questions. "The key," Silas muttered, his deep voice thoughtful. "Where is it?" Clara looked down at her lap, her expression turning into one of profound sorrow. "It was stolen from me by the very men I am running from," she whispered softly. "They think they can find a way to bypass the lock, but they don't know about the acid trap. They are tracking me through the mountains right now, and they will not stop until they have this box." Silas looked out the small cabin window, watching the snow pile higher and higher against the glass. He had spent years avoiding the troubles of the world, seeking peace in his isolated paradise. But now the world had arrived at his doorstep in the form of a mysterious, penniless woman. He looked back at Clara, noting her fragile beauty against the backdrop of his rugged cabin. He looked at his own massive, scarred hands, knowing he possessed the strength to protect her. "The storm will keep anyone from tracking you tonight," Silas said, his voice firm and steady. "But when the sun rises, the snow will stop, and the hunt will begin. I don't know what kind of secret is locked inside that box, Clara, but nobody comes to my mountain to threaten a guest under my roof." Clara looked at the massive, long-haired mountain man, feeling a sudden sense of safety she hadn't felt in years. Silas Thorne had spent his life hiding from his past, but this locked box was about to force him into a dangerous future. Neither of them knew that the secrets inside would soon unravel a truth that would change both of their lives forever. The roaring blizzard finally died down just before the first light of dawn. The furious winds fell completely silent, leaving behind an eerie, heavy quietness. The Rocky Mountains were covered in a fresh, thick blanket of pure white snow. Inside the log cabin, the fire had burned down to a bed of glowing red embers. Silas Thorne was already awake, standing silently by the small, frost-covered window. His long, dark hair fell loosely over his broad shoulders as he peered into the woods. His massive, muscular arms were crossed tightly over his chest, his eyes scanning the tree line. He knew that the fresh snow would make tracking difficult, but not impossible for desperate men. On the fur blankets near the hearth, Clara was still fast asleep, exhausted from her ordeal. Even in her sleep, her hands were resting protectively over the heavy, iron-bound wooden box. Silas walked quietly over to the fireplace, trying not to disturb his sleeping guest. He threw 2 large oak logs onto the embers, and bright orange flames quickly came back to life. The crackling of the wood woke Clara, her eyes snapping open in sudden panic. She instantly gripped the locked box, relaxing only when she saw the giant mountain man. "The storm has passed," Silas said, his deep, gravelly voice breaking the silence. "But the danger hasn't. We need to move if you want to stay ahead of those men." Clara sat up, wrapping the woolen blanket tightly around her shivering shoulders. "They won't stop, Silas," she said softly, her voice filled with a deep, haunting fear. "The man leading them is named Vance, and he is a ruthless, cold-blooded mercenary. He was hired by my own uncle to kill me and bring back this locked box at any cost." Silas poured her a hot mug of black coffee, handing it over with his scarred hand. "Why would your own blood want you dead over a wooden box, Clara?" Silas asked bluntly. Clara took a slow sip, the warmth bringing a bit of color back to her pale face. "Because of what is inside, even though they don't know the full truth of it," she explained. "My grandfather was a powerful and incredibly wealthy land baron in the Eastern Territories. Before he died, he realized my uncle was a corrupt, wicked man who would ruin the family. So he locked the true legal deeds, the family gold bonds, and his final will inside this box. He gave me the box, but my uncle's men ambushed us and stole the unique key. Without the documents inside, my uncle cannot legally claim the vast fortune and land. If I can get this box to a federal judge in the city, my uncle will be ruined forever." Silas listened intently, his piercing dark eyes fixed on the antique steel lock. He had spent years avoiding the greed of civilized men, but this felt different. This was a helpless woman being hunted by wolves, and Silas hated wolves. Suddenly, Silas's ears perked up, his instincts instantly locking onto a strange sound outside. It was the faint, unmistakable crunch of heavy boots breaking through the fresh crust of snow. Silas immediately blew out the oil lamp, plunging the cabin into a dim, shadows-filled twilight. "Stay down," Silas whispered fiercely, his massive frame moving with surprising silence. He reached over the doorway and pulled down his heavy, double-barreled hunting rifle. Outside, 3 heavily armed men were creeping through the pine trees, their rifles raised. They were wearing dark leather coats, their faces hardened by greed and the harsh winter. The man in the lead, Vance, smiled cruelly as he spotted the chimney smoke from Silas's cabin. "She's in there," Vance muttered to his men, gesturing for them to fan out and surround the house. "Remember, the uncle wants the girl dead, but that locked box must not have a single scratch on it." Inside the cabin, Silas stood flat against the log wall right next to the heavy wooden door. His heart beat with a calm, steady rhythm. He was a master of survival in this wilderness. Clara crouched low behind the heavy stone fireplace, holding her breath, clutching the box. Suddenly the front door was violently kicked open, splintering the wooden frame. The first mercenary stepped inside, his rifle raised, looking wildly into the dim room. Before he could react, Silas lunged forward like a striking mountain lion. His massive muscular arm swung around, his fist connecting with the man's jaw with terrifying force. The loud crack of bone echoed through the cabin as the mercenary was lifted off his feet. He crashed heavily onto the floor, completely unconscious before he even hit the ground. The second mercenary rushed the doorway, firing his pistol blindly into the darkness. The bullet grazed Silas's thick wolf-pelt coat, but it did not slow the giant down. Silas grabbed the barrel of the man's rifle with his bare hand, twisting it violently downward. Using his incredible leverage, Silas drove his knee straight into the man's chest. The mercenary gasped for air as the breath was completely forced out of his lungs. Silas threw him out into the snow, where he lay groaning in agony. But Vance, the clever leader, did not rush through the front door like his foolish men. Instead, he kicked open the small back window, aiming his pistol directly at Clara. "Drop the weapons, mountain man!" Vance shouted, his voice dripping with cold malice. "Or the girl dies right here and I take the box anyway." Silas froze, his massive frame turning slowly to face the back window. His long, dark hair fell over his face, his eyes burning with a silent, deadly fury. He lowered his rifle slowly, placing it on the floor, his mind calculating his next move. Vance smiled sneerily, stepping through the broken window frame into the cabin. "You're a big bastard, aren't you?" Vance mocked, keeping his pistol leveled at Silas's chest. "But muscle doesn't stop a lead bullet. Now hand over the girl and that wooden box." Clara looked at Silas, her eyes begging him not to give up, her hands trembling on the iron bands. Silas stood perfectly still, his muscular body tense, waiting for the perfect fraction of a second. Outside, a sudden heavy pile of snow slid off the cabin roof, creating a loud thud. Vance's eyes flicked toward the window for a microsecond, distracted by the sudden noise. That was the only mistake Silas Thorne needed. With explosive, terrifying speed, Silas lunged across the short distance between them. His massive hand clamped down on Vance's wrist, forcing the pistol upward toward the ceiling. A loud shot fired, the bullet embedding harmlessly into the thick wooden roof beams. Vance screamed in pain as Silas twisted his wrist, forcing him to drop the firearm. Vance tried to draw a wicked hunting knife from his belt with his free hand. But Silas was entirely relentless, his sheer physical dominance overwhelming the mercenary. He gripped Vance by the front of his heavy coat, lifting the man completely off the floor. With a powerful, deep grunt, Silas hurled Vance across the room. Vance crashed violently into the heavy wooden table, shattering it into pieces of kindling. He rolled onto the floor, coughing up blood, his ribs broken from the immense impact. Silas walked over, picking up his heavy iron chopping axe from the corner of the room. "Get off my mountain," Silas growled, his voice sounding like a rumbling avalanche. "If I see you or your men near this valley again, you won't leave it alive." Vance, terrified by the sheer ferocity of the giant mountain man, dragged himself backward. He scrambled out of the broken window, yelling for his injured men to help him retreat. Silas watched them go, knowing that this victory was only temporary. "They will come back," Clara said, tears of fear and relief spilling down her pale cheeks. "And next time they will bring an entire army of mercenaries to burn this cabin down." Silas turned to look at her, wiping a streak of blood from his cheek with the back of his hand. "Then we won't be here when they do," Silas replied firmly, his mind fully made up. "You said the unique key was stolen from you. Do you know where they took it?" Clara nodded slowly. "An old tracker named Kurt took it. He lives in an abandoned mining camp. It's high up in the northern peaks, a dangerous place that few men dare to travel." Silas picked up his heavy winter pack, packing dried meat, blankets, and ammunition. "Then that is exactly where we are going." Silas said, strapping his heavy axe to his back. He looked at the locked box, feeling a strange, deep pull toward the mystery it held. He had no idea that the journey ahead would test every ounce of his massive strength, and he had no idea that the old mining camp held a secret that would shake his very world. With Clara following closely behind, the giant mountain man stepped out into the freezing wilderness. The journey into the high northern peaks was a brutal march against gravity and nature. The fresh snow was deep, reaching up to the giant mountain man's powerful knees. Silas broke the trail, his massive muscular frame cutting a path through the white wasteland. Clara followed closely in his footprints, clutching the iron-bound wooden box to her chest. The air grew dangerously thin and freezing as they ascended higher into the rugged mountains. The steep rocky trails were covered in a treacherous invisible layer of slick black ice. One wrong step meant a fatal plunge into the deep, dark canyons thousands of feet below. Silas stopped on a narrow ledge, his long, dark hair whipping violently in the freezing wind. He turned his gaze back, his piercing eyes scanning the white valleys far beneath them. He could see tiny, dark specks moving in the distance. Vance and his men were still tracking them. "They are relentless," Clara gasped, her breath coming in ragged, white clouds of vapor. "They don't care about the cold or the danger. They only care about the fortune inside this box." Silas adjusted the heavy winter pack on his broad shoulders and checked his iron axe. "The mountain destroys the weak, Clara," Silas said, his deep, gravelly voice steady and calm. "Let them follow us into the high peaks. The altitude will break them before I do." He reached down with his massive, calloused hand, effortlessly pulling her up a steep, rocky ledge. The touch of his warm, strong hand gave Clara a surge of desperate hope in this frozen hell. As the grey afternoon faded into a dim twilight, the shadows among the pine trees grew longer. Suddenly an eerie, blood-chilling howl echoed through the silent frozen canyon. Silas instantly stopped, his hand dropping to the handle of his heavy hunting knife. From the dark tree line, 5 massive timber wolves emerged, their eyes glowing with hunger. Their thick grey fur was matted with ice, and their jaws dripped with saliva as they circled. The wolves saw Clara as easy prey, their predatory instincts locked onto her frail form. One large alpha wolf lunged forward with terrifying speed, its sharp fangs bared. With a powerful roar, Silas stepped directly in front of Clara, shielding her with his body. He swung his heavy iron chopping axe in a wide, devastating arc through the freezing air. The blunt side of the heavy axe struck the alpha wolf mid-air, sending it crashing into a boulder. The remaining 4 wolves snarled in fury, rushing the giant mountain man from all sides. Silas moved with explosive speed, his muscular arms grabbing a wolf by its thick throat. With a display of sheer, terrifying physical strength, he slammed the beast hard into the snow. He drew his long hunting knife with his other hand, slashing defensively to keep the pack at bay. Clara watched in absolute awe as the lone giant fought off the wild beasts with raw ferocity. His long hair flew wild, and his muscular chest heaved as he stood as an unbreakable wall. Seeing their leader broken and facing an unstoppable human beast, the remaining wolves turned and fled. Silas wiped the wolf blood from his knife onto the snow, his breathing deep and heavy. "Are you hurt?" he asked, turning his intense gaze back toward the trembling woman. Clara shook her head, looking at him with a profound sense of gratitude and admiration. "No, because of you. I have never seen anyone fight like that," she whispered in amazement. "In these mountains you either become the monster or you get eaten by them," Silas replied bluntly. They pushed onward through the fading light until they finally reached the high mountain basin. Before them lay the old abandoned mining camp, a desolate ghost town frozen in time. Rotting wooden cabins stood like hollow skeletons under the heavy weight of the snow. This was a place where desperate men had once dug for gold, leaving only ruins behind. At the edge of the camp, near a dark cavern entrance, sat a small cabin with a flickering light. Silas approached the door cautiously, his hand resting firmly on the handle of his rifle. He knocked heavily, the loud thuds echoing through the empty, silent ghost town. The door creaked open slowly, revealing an old, weathered man with a long white beard. It was Kurt, the old tracker who had participated in the ambush against Clara's family. Kurt stared at the towering, muscular mountain man and instantly took a step back in fear. "I don't want any trouble, Thorne," the old tracker stammered, his hands shaking in retreat. Silas stepped inside the warm cabin, his massive frame completely filling the small room. Clara followed, holding up the locked box so the old man could see it clearly. "You helped Vance ambush my family, Kurt," Clara said, her voice filled with sharp anger. "You stole the unique key to this box. Tell us where it is or Silas will break you." Kurt looked at Silas's enormous shoulders and the heavy iron axe strapped to his back. He knew he stood absolutely no chance against the legendary beast of the mountains. "Vance didn't pay me enough to die for him," Kurt muttered, walking over to a loose floorboard. He pried the old wood open and pulled out a strange, beautifully crafted silver key. The key had intricate, delicate patterns that matched the bizarre engravings on the box's lock. "Take it," Kurt said, handing the silver key over to Silas's massive, scarred hand. "But you're too late. Vance and his mercenaries know this trail better than you think. They didn't just follow you. They used a shorter hidden path to cut you off." Suddenly, the glass window shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces as a rifle bullet flew through. The loud, deafening bang of gunfire erupted from outside, echoing fiercely across the mountain. Silas instantly tackled Clara to the floor, covering her body as splintering wood flew everywhere. "We have you surrounded, Thorne," Vance's cruel voice shouted from the darkness outside. "There are 10 of us out here with rifles. You have nowhere left to run. Hand over the girl and the locked box, and I might let you live to see tomorrow." Silas crawled over to the broken window, peering out into the moonlit ghost town. He could see the dark silhouettes of heavily armed mercenaries taking positions behind the ruins. The situation was desperate. They were trapped inside a fragile wooden cabin with no escape route. Clara looked down at the silver key in Silas's hand, and then at the iron-bound box. "We have the key, Silas," she said, tears of absolute desperation forming in her eyes. "We are so close to the truth, but we are going to die in this forgotten place." Silas looked at the silver key, and then he looked at his own massive, powerful hands. A strange, fierce calm came over the giant mountain man, his dark eyes burning with resolve. "We aren't dying tonight, Clara," Silas said, his deep voice sounding like a heavy promise. "They think they have trapped a man inside a house, but they forgot something important. They are on my mountain now, and out here I am the one who decides who lives or dies." He slipped the silver key safely into his heavy coat pocket and gripped his rifle tightly. He looked at the dark mining cavern entrance just 50 yards away through the back door. The stage was set for a final, violent clash in the freezing shadows of the high peaks. Neither of them knew that inside that dark cavern, the final piece of the puzzle awaited them. The wooden walls of the cabin splintered as a volley of rifle fire erupted from the darkness. Silas knew they couldn't survive a prolonged siege inside this fragile structure. "Grab the box and follow my lead," Silas roared over the deafening noise of gunfire. He kicked the cabin's flimsy back door completely off its hinges, exposing the snowy path. Clara clutched the iron-bound wooden box to her chest and ran right behind the giant. Vance's mercenaries spotted them moving through the shadows and shifted their aim. Bullets zipped through the freezing air, kicking up clouds of white snow around their boots. Silas fired 2 heavy rounds from his rifle, forcing the nearest attackers to dive for cover. With a massive surge of muscular power, Silas sprinted toward the dark entrance of the mine. They dove into the yawning mouth of the cavern just as a bullet struck the rock face above. The deep cavern was pitch black, filled with the cold, damp scent of ancient earth and stone. Silas pulled a small wooden torch from his pack and lit it, illuminating the rocky tunnel. "They won't follow us blindly into the dark," Silas whispered, his deep voice echoing in the cave. "But we need to find a place to stand our ground. This mine has only one way in and out." They walked deeper into the mountain, the sound of dripping water echoing all around them. Suddenly, the tunnel opened up into a massive cavernous chamber filled with old mining tools. In the center of the chamber sat a rusted iron table, completely undisturbed for decades. Silas stopped and turned to Clara, his long dark hair matted with sweat and melting snow. "This is it," Silas said firmly. "It's time to open the box and see what we are fighting for." Clara placed the heavy wooden container onto the rusted iron table with trembling hands. Silas reached into his heavy wolf pelt coat and pulled out the intricate silver key. He handed the key to Clara, his piercing dark eyes fixed entirely on the blackened steel lock. Remember what you said about the acid trap, Silas warned, his gravelly voice low. Turn it slowly and do not force the mechanism if it resists. Clara took a deep, shaky breath, her fingers sliding the silver key into the complex lock. The key fit perfectly, the engraved symbols on the dial aligning with a soft metallic click. She turned the key clockwise, listening intently to the internal gears shifting inside the wood. A sharp mechanical snap echoed through the quiet cavern chamber as the heavy lock popped open. Clara slowly lifted the heavy lid, revealing the contents protected inside the dark hardwood. There were no glittering diamonds and there was no stacked yellow gold inside the box. Instead, the container held thick stacks of legal land deeds, official bonds, and a leather journal. Clara picked up the legal document on top, her eyes widening as she read the elegant cursive text. "It's all here," she whispered, tears of relief and victory spilling down her pale cheeks. "The original deeds proving my uncle has no legal right to our family's vast estate." But Silas wasn't looking at the deeds. His eyes were locked onto a faded photograph in the lid. The photograph showed a younger version of Clara's grandfather standing next to another giant man. That second man possessed the exact same broad shoulders, fierce eyes, and long hair as Silas. Silas reached out with a scarred, trembling hand, picking up the old leather journal. Silas opened the journal to the first page, his eyes scanning the faded ink with sudden shock. The journal belonged to Clara's grandfather, detailing a secret he had hidden from the world. 20 years ago, Clara's grandfather had a trusted partner in these mountains, William Thorne. William Thorne was Silas's father, a man who had helped build the massive family fortune. But when William was tragically killed in a mining accident, Clara's corrupt uncle stepped in. The uncle had stolen the Thorne family share, burning their estate and driving young Silas into exile. Clara's grandfather had spent his final years trying to undo the great injustice done to the Thornes. "Silas," Clara whispered in absolute disbelief, reading over his massive shoulder. "The deeds, half of the entire valley territory, doesn't belong to my family at all. It legally belongs to you. Your father was the co-owner of everything my uncle stole." Silas stood perfectly still, his massive muscular chest heaving as the truth washed over him. He had spent a decade living like a wild beast, believing he had no family and no past. But this penniless woman hadn't just brought danger to his mountain, she had brought his identity. "So my entire life of hiding was based on a lie," Silas murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Before he could process the truth, the sound of clapping echoed from the dark tunnel entrance. Vance stepped into the cavern chamber, flanked by his remaining 6 heavily armed mercenaries. "What a touching family reunion," Vance sneered, raising his pistol with a cruel, bloody smile. "But dead men can't inherit land, Thorne. Hand over the box or I paint these rocks with your blood." Silas turned slowly, his towering frame shielding Clara and the open box behind him. The vulnerability was gone from his eyes, replaced by a cold, animalistic fury. "You took my family's legacy," Silas growled, his deep voice shaking the very cavern walls. "And you threatened the woman under my protection. You do not leave this cave alive." Vance screamed to his men, "Fire! Kill him now!" But Silas was already moving with explosive, terrifying speed born of pure rage. He grabbed a heavy rusted iron table, using his immense muscular strength to flip it forward. The heavy table acted as a solid shield, absorbing the incoming volley of lead bullets. Silas lunged from behind the table like a striking predator, wielding his heavy iron axe. He swung the axe, shattering the rifle of the nearest mercenary and sending him crashing to the floor. Silas grabbed another attacker by the throat, throwing him violently into the jagged cavern wall. The mercenaries panicked, terrified by the raw, unstoppable power of the legendary mountain man. Silas moved through the shadows of the cave like a ghost, neutralizing the men one by one. Vance saw his men falling and panicked, turning his pistol toward Clara to shoot her. "No!" Silas roared, dropping his axe and diving across the rocky floor with desperate speed. He tackled Vance before the mercenary could pull the trigger, crashing them both into the stone. Vance drew his hunting knife, slashing wildly, cutting a deep gash across Silas's muscular shoulder. Silas didn't even flinch. He gripped Vance's knife arm with a crushing vice-like grip. With a powerful shout, Silas disarmed the leader and threw a devastating punch to his jaw. Vance collapsed onto the cold stone floor, completely defeated and broken. The cavern fell completely silent once more, save for the heavy, ragged breathing of Silas. Clara rushed over to his side, her hands instantly checking the bloody wound on his shoulder. "You're hurt," she said, her voice trembling with intense care and profound emotion. "It's just a scratch," Silas replied, a rare, soft smile breaking through his rugged beard. "The mountain has given me worse, but the wolves are finally gone, Clara." They gathered the precious legal documents, the silver key, and the old journal from the box. Weeks later, the winter snows began to melt, giving way to the bright green of spring. With the legal deeds in hand, Silas and Clara traveled down to the grand city in the valley. A federal judge reviewed the ironclad documents, stripping the corrupt uncle of his stolen wealth. The uncle was arrested for his crimes, and the vast family fortune was finally restored. But Silas Thorne did not choose to live in a grand mansion in the crowded, noisy city. He returned to his beloved mountains, but he was no longer an isolated, lonely hermit. Using his immense wealth, he built a beautiful, grand wooden estate in the heart of the valley. Clara stayed by his side, the deep bond forged in the freezing blizzard turning into a lifelong love. The penniless woman who had guarded a locked box with her life had found her ultimate protector. And the muscular, long-haired mountain man had finally found his true home, his family, and his purpose. Their lives had changed forever, all because of a secret hidden inside a locked wooden box. What would you have done if you found that box in the snow? Let me know in the comments below. If you loved this epic journey, make sure to smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next cinematic story. Thanks for watching and see you in the wilderness.